everyone. I hope you're having a good Demand Gen Summit thus far. This session today is on cracking the code on growth. And really what we're looking at here is the human side of go-to-market and how that makes a difference in growth. So who am I? My name is Chris Frank, and I've been in startups for about 20 years, maybe a little bit more now. And I'm on my 11th full-time startup right now, and I've helped many more along the way. So everything from the Ciscos of the world to early seed stage companies. This will date myself here, but I was part of the dot-com boom in Seattle, part of the bust as well, unfortunately. And I've worked for several companies in the Silicon Slopes, which many of you are very familiar with, as well as Silicon Valley. Industry-wise, I've been involved with software services and hardware companies, and really have been exposed to most of the business models out there, B2B, B2C, and the channel. So it's not to say that I know more about the subject than anyone, but I think hopefully I'll be able to share a few things with you on this side of things. All right, so this is a statistic that you hear a lot in the industry, right? 90% of startups fail. And when you go and you try to find the source of that, it's really funny. I think there's a lot of propagation of that stat without really thinking about it. I think in the back end, we've seen some additional studies come out in the last couple of years that state more accurately, it's probably in the 70–80% range. The Small Business Association says about 20% of businesses fail in the first 18 months or so. Some newer stuff around startups, because they are riskier. Nano Globals and some sites like that we'll talk about 70–75% range. So there are a lot, right? There are a lot that fail. And I think it's interesting around the reasons why they fail. When you look out there in the surveys, a lot of them will say, hey, it's because of market fit. It's because of their cash positions. And lastly, or at least the third place usually is the team and the reasons why they failed. So there's an author, his name is Tom Eisenman, I believe is how you pronounce his name. He's part of the Harvard Business Review, and he wrote a book called Why Startups Fail. So I'd recommend that for anyone. But he writes some articles out there on the Harvard Business Review as well. And in some of those articles, it's really interesting. They talk about how VCs see the failure of startups. And not surprisingly, a lot of that blame is placed on the entrepreneur. Lack of grit, lack of acumen, lack of leadership ability. But the secondary side of that, which is the process, right? The market fit failure. And so there's that whole, this is a whole list of things that there's really a focus on when startups fail. Usually they talk about the process, the problem definition, the solution development, and the solution validation. And all those things I think are valid, but they don't cover the human side really well. And I think when a lot of founders go in, the advice that I've seen recently is, hey, you hire for the first 18 months of your life, and you don't necessarily need to look beyond that. You hire what you need right now. And so there's this attitude that when you go in and you hire, they either have it or they don't. That person's either going to perform or they won't. And it's interesting that in Tom, when he talks about that, he talks about bad bedfellows, basically. When you're talking about the team of investors and partners and team members, they form that really critical human element of success. And it's interesting, I think a couple years ago, I came across a CEO and he told me, no one ever taught me how people work. And it's very true. I see a lot of founders struggle with the people side of it because maybe they haven't had to deal with that in the earlier part of their career, or I don't know exactly the reason why, but I think a lot of it is there is so many things to do as an entrepreneur, as a founder, or as a department head when you're trying to grow, that tends to be the last on your list, is to try to figure out people and why they act the way that they do and why they either perform or they don't perform. So in that journey of, solving that, what is the problem of the vision that you're going after, the MVP, the validation, to the build out, all the way to the scale up, it's important to understand people in that and how they can help you be successful. So I don't think in this next slide, I don't think anyone ever, and this is an eye chart, so I apologize, but I'll take you through it here. I don't think anyone ever takes a position thinking that they want to do a bad job, right? But where you're at in your career and how you're supported create an outcome. And I think that's really important to think about. So what you're looking at here, these are all approaches to common startup needs. And it's all based on the phase of career that someone is in and why a founder typically approaches them, right? So if you were in early career, let's take, for example, just creating the message to your ICP or ideal customer profile, your core messaging. Typically what a founder will do is they'll go out and they'll hire a writer, right? And someone that can get some of the basic things done. The problem with that is that there's a lot of management in there. The person doesn't necessarily know what to do. They might say, hey, what should I write and how should I structure that? If you're going out a little later and you're worried, okay, maybe that's not right the first time we went around with this, maybe we need to get it done a little bit better. And so you go to a mid-career person, they might say, hey, do I have all the right perspectives in place and the time to leverage all those perspectives correctly? And a late stage person or late career person might say, how do we evolve what we're really talking about here into various marketing channels? And how do we propagate that cross-functionally? How do we leverage that cross-functionally? So there's all of these different perspectives that you get based on the stage of career that someone is at. So the second one here, I'm not going to go through all of them, but the second one here is interesting in that what channels you pursue, what marketing channels you pursue as a company when you first come out of the gate. And this has a huge impact on your company, right? Marketing can typically be your largest spend outside of your payroll. So it is really important to get this right. If you're hiring people early on, early career people, what will happen is that, they'll say this is something we should try. If it's mid-career, it's, hey, these are some best bets based on my past experience. And if you're getting someone a little later career, you're going to find a prioritized analysis of where to go with a methodology and with a plan. So it's not to say that you shouldn't hire early or mid-career people, but you do need to be able to have a balance, especially when you're first starting out, and have in the back of your minds the timing right for being able to do that. And there's some things as a founder, if you're the kind of founder that likes to have a lot of control in the beginning, that's something that you're going to need to evolve over time and change over time to be able to grow and to scale. And so there is a lot of concern, I realize, upfront with cost and doing things effectively with a later stage career person. And there's a bigger risk involved in something like that. But there's a balance along the way when you're hiring to be able to get there. All right, so these are some real common mistakes in hiring. And it's really looking at how does all this translate into a phase build out of a company or a team. And so this is just a couple of examples here, but typically in the MVP and the validation stage, a lot of companies will hire a writer early on versus a product marketing leader, which they really need at that point to be able to hit the market well out of the gate. And so what someone like a product marketing leader will give you versus a writer are like night and day at that point. And so I've seen companies flounder for several years at this point because they're not willing to make that jump. And this is really looking at marketing as an example here, but it could be any department, it could be sales or other places where you're trying to decide where to go and when to hire. So the second part here is the build out phase. And what the mistake that a lot of people make is they will hire someone that's very familiar with specific channels versus a department leader that may have a broader breadth of experience and can really look at that more subjectively and say, hey, we should go into this based on the data or we shouldn't. And I'll give you an example here. The current place that I'm at now, we actually looked and we thought, hey, these are channels that have all worked in the past. Email was one of them, and email nurture tracks to be able to engage people along the way. That's really a common one that people know how to do, but it's a really big investment from a channel manager perspective, right? You invest a lot of time and energy into that. Well, interestingly, we found a couple months into it that people weren't responding. It was an IT audience, and they had they had some cynicism around marketing, to say the least. And so that channel was not effective at all. And had we hired a specific channel manager for that, they would be out of a job, or they wouldn't know how to pivot and they would flounder for the next year. So because we didn't do that, because we didn't hire a channel manager specifically for that, we hired people with a skill set beyond that, we were able to pivot fairly quickly. So that capability to be able to pivot based on experience is really important. All right. So having said that, maybe let's go into the next part here. So the first part is really experience. The next part here is really based on mindset. So there are approaches to work based on phase of career, and I think mindset. Both of those are important. And so this, I think, combined with what we saw a couple slides ago, are really the critical part to understanding when putting together the right team. So people often slide down this mindset scale. They'll go from growth back down to fear and pessimism. They typically don't go the other way. So, and do I think that all these mindsets, that's all there is? No, I think there's many, many more mindsets that you can have within a company when you approach the work within your company. But I think these are the most dramatic in terms of their effect on the outcome of your company. So we know that a highly engaged workforce, just to give you some stats here, a highly engaged workforce increases profitability by about 21%. That's some information done or presented by HR Cloud. I think there's some additional information there as well that you find interesting. But it really does have an effect on how successful you're able to be and how fast you're able to grow. So I think there's a big challenge here that you'll see. So as we go through this, you're going to find some differences. So if someone's acting out of a fear or permission-based mindset, and it's typically because they, either they come in that way or they feel that way because of a series of things that have happened where they've been shut down, right? So typically, if they operate out of that in an early career, they just find out what to do next. So you see in that scenario, the work efficiency goes way down. If you're mid-career, they're going to start second guessing the skill set they already have and be overwhelmed because the depth of the things that they need to accomplish grows. And then later career, if there's already a bias for success, if you're dictating too much as a founder, what'll happen is that they'll just, they'll question why are they doing that work at all. And so that can be very counterproductive to not only the relationship, but your company as a whole. Status quo or pessimism, I think, is the silent killer of a lot of companies, because it's really hard to tell when these people are acting this way. But from an early career standpoint, they'll do the draft or whatever it is, complete the initial version of the work that they need to do, and they'll believe it's going to be wrong putting it out there, and so they'll just spin their wheels on it. And then the second one is the mid-career. They'll believe that they've done what they've needed to do, but the belief is that the company will never get it, they'll never appreciate them, and so they move on and they don't necessarily do their best work. Late career, it's just a question of whether their ideas are really being valued, and the questioning why they're there. From a growth mindset, and I want you to take a look at this. This is what changes everything. If you can get people into this growth mindset, that's when things start to click within a startup and you start to accelerate, and you start to get momentum with your team. And once you get that momentum with the team, that's when the business starts to gain momentum too. So from an early career, see the difference here. Early career might be something like, the reaction might be something like, hey, I'm looking at how others approach this problem and I'm testing this one because this. Mid-career, it's, well, I can take these ideas and I can adapt the ideas that I've already found, the things that I've already found to be true in other companies, and I'm going to prove and adapt them here. And let's see how they work. A late stage career person is going to look at that and they're going to say, okay, this part of the strategy work, this needs rethinking, and let's try a different approach. And so you can see the difference in that engagement of people, and that engagement doesn't happen when the mindset shifts. So what do you need to do to really get people in these specific mindsets? And you'll hear a lot of things, and you've probably read a lot of books around creating a safe space, right? I think that's just a very small part of it. Creating a safe space, and particularly a safe space to fail. And if you're looking at the lean startup methodology, it's all about the hypothesis and the testing, right? And that's how you get to success. I think that's part of it. Definitely creating a safe space to fail. For early career, it's also important to have an expectation of ownership, in the learning and in the iteration of their work. And so that's something that's oftentimes missing. The third part of that there is also the future possibility of advancement for people that are early career. For mid-career, it's the same thing. They do want to see that opportunity for advancement, but it's also the appreciation of the experience that they do bring to the table together. Mid-career people also love the ideation together to be able to get to a new outcome. And there's also an ownership, I think, in the learning, the iteration, and the reporting that is very appropriate for someone who is mid-career to think through the things that they implement or want to implement from that side and to own that. Late career, I think it's more around goal alignment, making sure that there is that alignment going into any type of venture that you're trying to do. And there's trust in the creation of the strategy to succeed. Lastly, I think the last part of that is really the recognition, the joint leadership, and some company ownership, which is an obvious part of someone who's a little later in career that brings more to the table. So all of these things have different effects. So for early career person, there's more engagement and there's a momentum in terms of their execution that happens. In terms of mid-career, there's an acceleration of that channel performance because they're testing. They have that engagement to be able to test more often. And late career, it's really an acceleration of results, and that comes from integrated marketing and putting all of the pieces together and those pieces playing off of each other. So very different in terms of once you have that mindset, being able to execute effectively and to build momentum in the company. So what happens when you bring all those things together, right? What happens when you bring the stage of career and the experience together with that mindset? Well, you would approach things really differently. So for example, if you're building out SEO, search engine optimization, and you're doing that and building out a bunch of content to be able to support that, and you're doing the research. So early career, what that might look like is, well, what topics do I write about, and how do I structure this? If it's a pessimistic point of view or a status quo point of view or mindset, they might say, well, hey, I can write whatever they want me to write, but they can figure out what to do with it. So from a growth mindset, here's an approach to the topic that we can do, and what people say works. And I'm not going to cover the rest of this here, but from a growth mindset, mid-career, this looks like, hey, this is the plan that looks like for production in terms of these pieces of content. So how do we prioritize that content? How do we take lessons learned from the data, and how do we improve it the next quarter? So there's an engagement in that process. And what's interesting is that oftentimes leaders and founders try to force a growth mindset. But if you haven't done the things in this last slide, if you haven't done all of these things that you need for positive engagement and for a growth mindset to take hold with an organization, they don't happen. In fact, the status quo or the pessimism increases within your organization if you don't do these things to set yourself up and your teams up for success. So the last part, late career, is okay, how do we apply that? If someone does have a growth mindset, oh, okay, we found some gaps and how our competitors approach this channel. We have a strategy based on our strengths, and we have some new channel approaches which they want to try out. So that's a vast difference from the deprioritization and the stalling and the ineffectiveness of teams when they have a different mindset. So I hope that was helpful in terms of, there's a lot of information, but hopefully you'll get a takeaway of this as well and be able to look at it a little bit more in depth. But I think the next steps are really just asking yourself some questions. What are those most pressing issues for your company to get to the next level in development? And how do I think about those in the context of my team's experience and their mindset right now? What's the cost of not getting to that next phase, right? If we don't gain some momentum now, if we don't figure X out now, is that going to affect our funding round? Is that going to affect our ability to compete a year from now? Are our competitors gaining ground? So all of those, I think, are important questions to ask. What are the roadblocks that we're encountering because of our missteps? So maybe we have hired out of order, or maybe we have done some things that negatively affect the mindset of our teams. So whether it's hiring, whether it's their role gaps right now, there's some execution gaps, our ability to pivot, what are those road gaps that we're really encountering right now? Next, after that, I think it's really understanding if those issues are in your own head or if they can actually be validated by the team. And even if you think your team does have a growth mindset now, I would survey them. I would ask them, independently if, where they're at. And oftentimes you'll find at least one or two people that are burnout or they're not executing to the level that they want, either for personal reasons or because they're seeing cues internally where we haven't met all of those things for them to be able to have that growth mindset. So after that, I think it's what can we do to retain the good parts of what we've done thus far? And how do we prioritize some of those recognized gaps that we have in terms of the creation of our teams and the support of our teams? And lastly, am I really the right person to do this? You're not necessarily the right person. Sometimes a founder, CEO, or department head is not necessarily the right person to go into to implement this. Sometimes you need outside help to be able to do that. And sometimes you need an objective change in process and how you support people to make that happen. So anyway, I hope all of this was helpful, and I hope you're having a good summit. Please let me know about your journey and how you're doing in terms of supporting your teams and really leveraging their experience and creating that growth mindset within your company. So thank you.